He called her just a wife. 13 months later, a judge gave her 34% of his company. He looked her in the eyes after 11 years of marriage and said he'd found someone else. Someone younger. Someone Korean. And then he laughed. She didn't scream. She didn't throw anything. She didn't beg. She sat completely still, and she listened. Because Adunala had spent the last 4 months doing something Juno never thought to ask about. She had been pulling documents. Methodically. Every contract he'd ever signed. Every investor filing. Every wire transfer. Every email thread she had ever been copied on, going back 11 years. She had a folder. A very thick folder. And sitting across from her husband as he laughed at the wreckage of their marriage, she thought about that folder. She didn't say a word. She just nodded. Because here is the thing about a woman who has spent over a decade building something alongside a man who never once put her name on it. She knows exactly where the foundation cracks. And she knew his better than anyone alive. By the time Juno walked out of that room feeling like he had won, the clock had already started. Before we get to what she took, you need to understand what she came from. Because Adunala did not arrive in this world with safety nets. Her mother, Damilala, came to Atlanta from Lagos in 1987 with 2 suitcases, a nursing aid certificate, and determination that doesn't have a name in English, but in Yoruba, they call it Pinun. A settled, unshakable decision about who you are going to be. Damilala cleaned hotel rooms. 6 days a week. Double shifts on holidays, because holidays paid more, and more meant Adunala's school fees got paid on time. Adunala watched all of it. Every morning her mother left before dawn. Every night she came home with swollen feet and still managed to sit at the kitchen table and ask, "How was school? What did you learn today?" That is the woman who raised Adunala. So when people later tried to describe Adunala as lucky, as someone who stumbled into opportunity, they revealed exactly how little they were paying attention. She had earned a full scholarship through her undergraduate degree and was deep into a joint JD-MBA program at Emory. Business law, startup contracts, intellectual property. When she met Juno, she had a plan. And then she met Juno. It was a graduate school networking event. Juno was standing near the back of the room, not working it, not performing, just thinking. He had a napkin in his hand, and he was sketching something on it. She asked what it was. He showed her a rough diagram of a platform concept. A tech solution for cross-border small business payments between the US and East Asia. Clunky on the napkin, but the idea underneath it was sharp. She told him the idea was solid, but the legal structure he was imagining would get him sued inside of 18 months. He laughed. She was right, and they both knew it. They talked for 3 hours that night. And it wasn't money, because he didn't have any. It wasn't status. His family back in Busan were working people. His father ran a small printing shop. His mother taught primary school. What she saw was raw, unpolished vision. And Adunala, who had grown up watching her mother work herself to the bone in someone else's building, had always wanted to build something that was theirs. She believed in his idea before a single investor did, before his own family understood it, before he fully believed in it himself. Within a year, they were together. Within 3, they were married. And somewhere in between the wedding and the launch meetings and the investor pitches and the late nights going over term sheets at their kitchen table, Adunala quietly shelved her bar exam prep. Just temporarily, she told herself. Just until they get the company off the ground. She didn't marry a successful man. She married a struggling one, and she made him successful. And building a man's empire rarely puts your name on the deed. Rarely. Let's talk about what 11 years actually looks like. The actual 11 years. Year 1 of the marriage. They were living in a 900-square-foot apartment in Midtown Atlanta. Juno's company, Quan Bridge Technologies, existed mostly as an LLC filing and a pitch deck. Adunala was the one who made that pitch deck readable. Juno was brilliant at the concept, the architecture of the idea, the technical logic behind it. But he did not yet fully understand how American venture capital thought, what language moved them, what fears they had, what they needed to hear before they would write a check. Adunala knew. She had studied it. Contract law, investor psychology, startup valuation frameworks. This was her program. This was what she had trained for. So she sat with him night after night, and she rebuilt those decks. Restructured the narrative. Replaced the technical language with confident storytelling that makes a room full of investors lean forward in their chairs. She also managed the company's early bookkeeping from their kitchen table, tracked every expense, filed the quarterly reports, set up the vendor payment system. She did all of this while also working a part-time contract role to help cover their rent, because the company wasn't paying anyone yet. She shelved her bar exam prep for the first time in year 2, just temporarily. And somewhere in that same year, quietly, without naming it even to herself, she began keeping copies. Every email she sent on company business. Every document she signed. Not as strategy, she would not have called it that. Just the instinct of a woman who had watched her mother build someone else's life and learned, without being taught, that nothing you do disappears unless you let it. The study materials stayed in a box on the top shelf of the closet in the second bedroom. She could see the spine of one of the prep books from the doorway. She stopped looking at it after a while. It was easier that way. By year 3, Quan Bridge had its first real investor meeting. Adunala hosted the dinner. She researched the lead investor, his background, his previous portfolio companies, his cultural preferences. She cooked. She managed the conversation. When a moment of tension surfaced over a misunderstanding about the company's Korea-facing operations, she smoothed it over so naturally that the investor later told Juno it was the most comfortable pitch dinner he'd ever attended. The check came through 6 weeks later. Juno's name was on the press release. Adunala's name was not. Year 3, their daughter Zoe was born, and Adunala, who had already given 2 years of her professional ambitions to this company, gave something she could never get back. She gave the version of herself that might have made partner at a firm, or passed the bar, or built something with her own name on the door. She told herself it was a season. By year 6, Quan Bridge was operating in 4 markets. They had 31 employees. They had been featured in Forbes, in TechCrunch, in a Korean business publication that called Juno a visionary, a man bridging 2 economies. Every article, every feature, every award ceremony. Juno Quan. Not once did any of those stories mention the woman who had restructured his pitch, managed his books, hosted his investors, raised his daughter, and quietly placed her own ambitions in a drawer so his could breathe. Not once. And somewhere around year 8, something shifted. It wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. Juno started staying later at the office. The business trips to Seoul, which had always happened, started feeling different. Longer. Vaguer. He used to call every night when he traveled. Then every other night. Then, when he remembered, he stopped asking about her day. He stopped sitting at the kitchen table with her. He was physically present in that house less and less. And when he was there, he was somewhere else entirely. Adunala noticed. Of course she noticed. She was not a woman who missed things. But she told herself what exhausted, overextended women have told themselves for generations. He's under pressure. The company is growing. This is just a difficult season. It will pass. It did not pass. Zoe, who was 7 by then, had started climbing into her mother's bed at night. Children always know before anyone says a word. But the worst part wasn't that he was pulling away. The worst part was what Adunala found on a Tuesday afternoon in March. It was a Tuesday. Juno was in Seoul, or so she believed. Zoe was at school. The house was quiet. Adunala was going through the shared email account they used for household bills, something she had managed for years, because that was just one more thing she managed, when she saw it. A receipt. From a hotel in Buckhead. Atlanta. Not Seoul. Atlanta. Dated the same week he had told her he was traveling. She sat very still for a moment. Then she looked closer. The hotel was a place she knew. Upscale. Discreet. The kind of property that charged $400 a night and asked no questions. She went further back in the account. There was another receipt. And another. A jewelry store. A boutique on Peachtree Road that she had walked past 100 times. The purchase was significant. A number that made her breath catch. She had never received jewelry from that store. Not once. She knew the name before she fully admitted to herself that she knew it. Soyeon Lim had appeared in their lives 14 months earlier. Juno had introduced her at a company dinner as a new strategic consultant. Young, polished, soul-educated, brought in to help expand Kwon Bridge's Korean market relationships. Adunala had shaken Soyeon's hand. She had been warm, welcoming, even, because that is what she did. That is what she had always done, made everyone around her husband feel comfortable. She had even complimented Soyeon's work once, in passing, to Juno. He had not reacted. She understood now why. She printed the receipts. She made 2 copies. She put one in the folder. That was not who Adunala was. When Juno walked through the front door 2 days later, rolling his carry-on, acting like any other return from any other trip, she was sitting at the kitchen table, waiting. She placed the printed receipts on the table between them. She didn't say anything. She just watched him look at them. And here is the part that still, to this day, is difficult to process. He didn't panic. He didn't apologize. He didn't even flinch. He set down his bag. He pulled out the chair across from her. He sat down slowly, the way a man sits when he has already decided what he is going to say. And then Juno Kwon looked at the woman who had given him 11 years of her life and said, "I've been meaning to talk to you. I think we've grown apart. Adunala, I want a divorce." She asked how long. He said 8 months. 8 months. Zoe had just turned 7 when it started. Adunala had thrown her a birthday party. She had baked the cake herself. Juno had stood in that kitchen with his arm around his wife while their daughter blew out candles, and it had already been going on for months. She asked about Zoe. He said, "We'll figure it out." For words. For his daughter. And then Adunala asked the question that had been sitting in her chest since the moment she saw that first receipt. She asked about the company, about her role, about everything she had put into it, the pitch decks, the investor dinners, the bookkeeping, the years. She asked him, directly, clearly, without raising her voice, what he believed she was owed. Juno looked at her, and he said, "You were a wife, not a business partner. You're not on any of the paperwork." Let me say that one more time. You were a wife, not a business partner. You're not on any of the paperwork. 11 years. 2 shelved bar exam attempts. 1 daughter. Hundreds of hours of financial management, investor strategy, relationship building, pitch restructuring. You're not on any of the paperwork. She didn't respond. Not because she had nothing to say, but because in that moment, something settled inside of Adunala with a quiet, absolute clarity. She understood exactly what the next chapter of her life was going to look like. And it was not going to look like anything Juno Kwon was prepared for. Within 3 weeks of that conversation at the kitchen table, Juno had moved Soyeon into a condo in Brookhaven. 3 weeks. He didn't take long to grieve the marriage. He didn't take long to grieve anything. He simply moved. Forward. Onward. The way a man moves when he has already been living his next chapter for 8 months, while his wife was still in the previous one. The divorce papers arrived on a Thursday morning. Adunala was making Zoe's lunch when the process server knocked. She signed for the envelope. She put it on the counter. She finished making the lunch. She walked Zoe to the school bus. She waved until the bus turned the corner. Then she went back inside and opened the envelope. Juno's legal team was not a small operation. He had retained one of Atlanta's more aggressive family law firms, a firm with a reputation for moving fast and hitting hard. And they came with a position already fully formed. The argument was clean, and on paper it was devastating. Adunala had no formal employment contract with Kwon Bridge Technologies. She had no equity agreement, no partnership documentation, no stock certificates, no consulting retainer, nothing with her name on it that tied her legally to the company she had helped construct from a napkin sketch in a graduate school hallway. As far as the paperwork was concerned, she was a wife. The settlement offer they presented reflected exactly that assessment. Monthly spousal support, a number that was not nothing, but was not close to what 11 years of contribution was worth. The marital home. Full stop. Take it, they implied, and this goes smoothly. Push back, and we will make it very difficult. Her mother drove over from Atlanta's west side the following weekend. Damilala, who had cleaned hotel rooms for decades so her daughter could have options, sat across from Adunala at that same kitchen table and took her hands. And she said, "Baby, Maybe just take it. You can start over. You are still young. Zoe needs you stable. Just take it and start over. It almost worked. 3 days after her mother drove home, Adunala drove to the grocery store. She got as far as the parking lot. She pulled into a space, turned off the engine, and she didn't get out. She sat there for 45 minutes. She had not cried once since the moment those receipts hit the kitchen table. She had held it together for Zoe. She had held it together during the lawyer meetings. She had held it together when she saw a photo of Juno and Soyeon on someone's social media, taken at a restaurant she and Juno used to go to together. But in that parking lot, alone, with nobody watching, she came apart. 45 minutes. And when it was over, she sat up straight, wiped her face with the back of her hand, took one long breath. She drove home. She made dinner. She put Zoe to bed. And then, at some point that night, while she was standing at the kitchen sink, her phone rang again. She picked up, and something shifted. She didn't recognize the number immediately. The voice on the other end was measured, unhurried, deliberate. It was Professor Lawrence Osei, her old business law professor from Emory, a man who had written her a recommendation letter for graduate school and had followed quietly, from a distance, what she had built alongside Juno over the years. A former student, a woman Adunala, had once helped navigate a contract dispute in her second year, had seen the divorce filing in a public records search and called him. He didn't offer sympathy first. He didn't ask how she was doing. The first thing he said was, "Don't sign anything yet." 4 words. "Don't sign anything yet." She asked him why. He said, "Because I know someone who is going to want to look at 11 years of your emails, and I think what they find is going to change everything." She called Professor Osei back the next morning. She had slept 3 hours. She had already pulled the folder from where she kept it and placed it on the kitchen table before she dialed. When he answered, she said, "Tell me who to call." He told her. Professor Osei made 2 phone calls the morning after he spoke to Adunala. The first was to a forensic financial attorney named Raymond Achebe, a former federal investigator who had spent 15 years untangling corporate fraud cases before moving into private practice. He was known, specifically, for finding money that people believed they had successfully hidden. The second call was to a family law specialist named Diane Whitmore, 22 years of practice, a near-perfect record in complex asset divorce cases, and a particular reputation for cases where one spouse had made undocumented contributions to a shared business. Both of them agreed to take Adunala's case on contingency. That tells you something about what they saw when they looked at her situation. They asked her for everything. Every email, every text message, every photograph, every document she had ever touched that had anything to do with Quanbridge Technologies. She gave them 11 years of records. And then the 60 days began. What Raymond Achebe's team found in those 60 days was not a gap in the paperwork. It was a paper trail so thorough, so consistent, so undeniable, that when his lead investigator first laid it out across the conference room table, she apparently stopped mid-sentence and said, "He actually thought she had nothing." Here is what they found. Starting from the very first year of Quanbridge's operation, Adunala had communicated directly with vendors, investors, and legal representatives on behalf of the company. Not casually, not occasionally. Across vendors, investors, legal representatives, and operational contacts, hundreds of emails. 47 of those went directly to investors. Timestamped, detailed, substantive. Emails where she outlined financial strategy. Emails where she managed investor relationships. Emails where she negotiated vendor terms. Emails where she flagged legal risk in contracts before Juno's own lawyers caught it. Every single one, sent from an email address that included the Quanbridge domain, her own digital signature, on company business. For years. Then they found the contracts. In the company's early years, years 2 and 3, Adunala had signed vendor and supplier agreements. The signature line on those contracts read, Adunala Quan, Director of Operations, Quanbridge Technologies. Juno had given her that title verbally, casually, the way people in early-stage startups hand out titles before anyone thinks to formalize anything. He had never filed it, never put it in writing, never gave her a contract of her own. but she had signed documents under it. And those documents were legally executed. Binding. Real. Director of Operations. On paper. His paper. The signatures alone would not have been enough. But they were not alone. Then Adunala showed them the money. She had flagged it herself. The first week Raymond's team came in. She pulled the bank statement from her files, placed it on the table, and said, "This was mine before it was ever his. Here is the wire. Here is the memo line. Here is what I called it when I sent it." In the company's seed stage, before the first investor check cleared, there had been a funding gap. A moment where the operational costs threatened to stall everything before it started. Adunala had wired $47,000 from a personal account. The source of those funds was her maternal grandmother's inheritance, money that had been left specifically to her, in her name, before the marriage. She had put her grandmother's money into his company. There was a wire transfer record, a bank statement, a memo line that read, "Quan Bridge Seed Operations, Personal Contribution." She had documented it herself. Because Adunala documented everything. Because she was at her core a business law student who never fully stopped thinking like one. And then there were the text messages. Juno's own text messages, retrieved as part of standard discovery, showed something that his legal team had apparently not thought to review before filing their position. He had been texting Adunala about major business decisions consistently, not just in the early years. Last year, 8 months ago, while he was already deep into the affair, he had sent her a text asking her opinion on a significant contract restructure. She had responded with 3 paragraphs of detailed analysis. He had responded, "You're right. I'll tell the lawyers to revise." Not a wife giving an opinion over dinner. A business mind being consulted on a binding decision. Raymond Achebe presented the full findings to Adunala on a Wednesday afternoon. He laid it out methodically, without drama, the way a man presents facts he trusts completely. And when he was done, he looked at her across the table and he said, "Mrs. Kwan, you weren't just a wife. You were an undocumented co-founder. And we are going to prove it." Adunala was quiet for a moment. She asked one question. She said, "How long will this take?" Raymond said, "Long enough to do it right." She said, "Then let's begin." Juno's legal team, at this moment, was still operating on the assumption that this was a standard high-asset divorce. Straightforward. A settlement that had already been offered. A woman they expected to be worn down, emotionally exhausted, and legally outgunned. They had been preparing for a wife. They were about to meet something else entirely. When Diane Whitmore filed the opening motion, Juno's legal team requested 3 days to review it. That was unusual. Opposing counsel typically responds with immediate counterpositioning. You file, they push back, the dance begins. They asked for 3 days, which meant that when they read what Diane had filed, something in that document gave them pause. Good. The filing was comprehensive, and it was aggressive. First, equitable interest in Quan Bridge Technologies. The argument was not that Adunala had been an employee. It was that she had functioned, in every practical and documented sense, as a founding operational partner, and that the absence of formal paperwork did not erase the reality of that contribution. The emails, the signed vendor contracts, the seed funding wire, the years of time-stamped strategic input, all of it entered into the record as evidence of a partnership that Juno had benefited from without ever compensating or acknowledging. Second, retroactive compensation. Raymond's team had calculated, conservatively, the market value of the operational labor Adunala had provided over 11 years. Director-level financial management, investor relations, strategic consulting. They had put a number to every role she had filled without a salary, without a title, without so much as a footnote in a press release. The number was not small. Third, primary custody of Zoe. Diane had documented, carefully and without exaggeration, the pattern of Juno's emotional absence during the affair period. Missed school events. Canceled weekends. A daughter who had started climbing into her mother's bed at night because the house felt uncertain and she needed to be close to the one parent who was still fully present. The deposition took place on a Tuesday morning, 11 months, almost to the day, after Adunala had found those receipts in the shared email account. Juno arrived in a suit. Composed. flanked by 2 members of his legal team. Diane Whitmore sat across the table with a single legal pad, a pen, and 60 days of forensic documentation that she had memorized well enough that she barely needed to look at it. She began quietly. "Mr. Kwan, can you explain why your wife's email address appears on 47 investor communications sent from your company domain, including the pitch deck presentation that secured your series of funding?" Juno glanced at his lawyers. He said, "She was helping." Diane wrote something on her legal pad. She did not look up immediately. When she did, her expression had not changed at all. "Helping. I see." A pause. "And did this helping include the $47,000 wire transfer made from your wife's personal inheritance account, an account held solely in her name, funded by assets that predate the marriage, transferred directly into Quanbridge Technologies' operational account?" The room was very quiet. Juno looked at the table. His lawyer put a hand on his arm. The silence stretched. It stretched long enough that it became its own kind of answer. Not the legal end. That would come later, in a ruling that nobody in that courtroom would forget quickly. But the human end. The moment where the version of events Juno had told himself, where he was the visionary, the founder, the architect of everything, that version quietly collapsed. Under the weight of 47 emails, and $47,000, and 11 years, and a woman who had documented everything, because some part of her always knew she might need to. Then Raymond Achebe's forensic audit hit the company accounts. And that is where the case stopped being complicated, and started being a different kind of problem entirely for Juno Kwan. Within the first 30 days of the audit, Raymond's team identified a pattern of asset transfers that had begun, and this timing matters. Within 2 weeks of the divorce filing, Juno had begun moving money. He had been advised to. Quietly, before the filing was even complete, someone in his circle had told him to begin restructuring his holdings, to make the asset pool smaller before a court could measure it. A discrepancy in the domestic operating accounts flagged an outflow that didn't match any vendor, any payroll cycle, any operational expense Raymond's team could account for. They followed it. Not domestically. Not in ways that were easily traceable through standard discovery. Offshore. Shell structures through a holding company registered in a jurisdiction that was specifically chosen for its opacity. The transfers were structured carefully, broken into amounts designed to avoid automatic reporting thresholds. Layered. Deliberate. Someone had advised him on how to do this. Someone who understood that he was about to be in litigation and wanted to reduce the asset pool that a court could divide. That is fraud upon the court. When Diane Whitmore presented the offshore transfer documentation to the presiding judge, the temperature in that courtroom changed. Judges have seen most things. They are not easily moved. They sit through years of people behaving badly in divorce proceedings, and they process it with professional distance. This judge went very still. She reviewed the documentation for a long moment. And then she looked at Juno's legal team over the top of her reading glasses, and she asked them, in a voice that was perfectly level and therefore more frightening than anger, if they had anything to say. They asked for a recess. Juno's lawyers called Diane Whitmore's office the following morning. They wanted to settle. Not for the original number. Not for twice the original number. 3 times. They framed it as a gesture of good faith. As an acknowledgement of the complexity of the situation. As a path toward resolution that would spare everyone, particularly Zoe, the difficulty of extended litigation. Diane brought the offer to Adunala. She laid out the number. She explained what it meant. She gave her honest professional assessment of the risks of continuing versus the certainty of accepting. Adunala listened to all of it. Then she said, "No. Just that. No elaboration. No counterdemand. No." Diane nodded. She had expected that answer. The ruling came on a Thursday morning in October. 13 months after Adunala had found those receipts. 11 months after she had sat in a grocery store parking lot and come apart. 10 months after Raymond Achebe had laid 11 years of evidence across a conference room table and told her exactly what she was worth. There were no cameras. No gallery of onlookers. Just the parties, their counsel, and a judge who had spent the better part of 4 months reviewing a case that had grown considerably more complex than a standard high-asset divorce. Juno sat at his table in a dark suit. He had aged visibly in 13 months. Adunala sat at hers in a deep burgundy dress her mother had sent from Atlanta with a note that said simply, "Wear something that looks like who you are." She sat completely straight. She had not slept the night before, but you would not have known it. The judge began reading. On the matter of equitable interest in Quanbridge Technologies, the court found that Adunala's contributions to the company constituted a substantive, documented, and sustained operational partnership that predated the company's first external funding and continued through its period of significant growth. The signed vendor contracts, the investor communications, the seed funding wire transfer, the years of strategic consultation documented in text messages and emails, including communications as recent as 10 months prior to the divorce filing. The court found that the absence of formal documentation did not negate the reality of those contributions. It found that Juno Kwon had materially benefited from his wife's labor, expertise, and capital, and that to award her nothing from the business she had helped construct would constitute a profound and documentable injustice. Adunala was awarded a 34% equity stake in Quanbridge Technologies. At the company's current valuation, that figure represented $4.2 million. On the matter of retroactive compensation, the court accepted Raymond Achebe's conservative market rate assessment of Adunala's uncompensated operational labor across 11 years. She was awarded $680,000. On the matter of custody of Zoe, primary physical custody was awarded to Adunala. Juno was granted structured visitation, scheduled, documented, consistent. The court noted, without cruelty but without ambiguity, that the minor child's established pattern of seeking proximity to her mother during the period of marital instability was a relevant factor in determining where her primary stability resided. Zoe would go home with her mother. And then the judge addressed the offshore transfers. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She described what Juno had done in precise legal language, the structuring, the shell entities, the deliberate timing relative to the divorce filing, and she called it exactly what it was: fraud upon the court. Juno was sanctioned. The sanctions were significant. His legal fees, already substantial after 13 months of aggressive litigation, expanded further. The financial pressure on Quanbridge's operational accounts became acute. The company that was supposed to represent everything he had built was now bleeding from the inside. And here is the part that Juno had never once considered possible. His legal team contacted Diane Whitmore within 48 hours of the ruling. They needed to discuss the equity. There were two options available to Juno under the court order. He could buy out Adunala's 34% stake at fair market value, removing her from the company entirely, or he could accept her as a formal equity holder, a stakeholder, at the board level, in the company he had told her she had no claim to. The buyout number was $4.2 million. After the sanctions, after the legal fees, after 13 months of litigation costs, after the offshore transfer scheme had been unwound under court supervision, he did not have $4.2 million liquid. He could not buy her out. Adunala Kwon became a board-level equity stakeholder in Quanbridge Technologies. By court order, in the company that had processed her wire transfer and stored her emails and carried her signature on its earliest contracts, and then tried to hand her a settlement and show her the door. She didn't go through the door. She took a seat at the table. As for Soyeon, when the proceedings became public and her name appeared in the forensic audit documentation, she quietly stepped back. No announcement, no drama. She simply was no longer in the picture. When the judge finished reading the ruling that Thursday morning, the courtroom was still. Diane Whitmore placed her hand briefly on Adunala's arm. Raymond Achebe, seated behind her, exhaled. Juno stared at the table. And Adunala looked straight ahead. She didn't cry. She didn't turn around. She didn't look at Juno. She just looked straight ahead at the middle distance. And she exhaled. One long, slow, complete breath. 11 years. She finally exhaled. He called her just a wife. A court of law called her a co-founder. He said she wasn't on the paperwork. A judge put her name on it herself. He laughed, in that kitchen, on the day he asked for a divorce. I wonder if he was laughing on that Thursday morning in October. I don't think he was. 6 months after the ruling, Adunala sat for her bar exam. The one she had shelved twice. She passed on her first attempt. She didn't celebrate loudly. She called her mother, Damilala, who had cleaned hotel rooms for decades so her daughter could have options, picked up on the second ring. And when Adunala told her, there was a silence on the line that lasted just long enough to mean everything. Then Damilala said, I knew. I always knew. That was enough. That was more than enough. The practice she opened is small by design. It operates out of a suite of offices in Midtown Atlanta, clean, uncluttered, a space that feels intentional rather than impressive. The name on the door is her own. Her name. Only hers. The work she does there is specific. She focuses on women, and in particular, immigrant women and women of color, who are actively contributing to family businesses without formal documentation. Women who are doing the work, holding things together, pouring their expertise and their hours, and sometimes their own inherited money into something that carries someone else's name. She sits with them before it becomes a crisis. She helps them understand what to document, how to document it, what language matters legally, what a signature on a vendor contract actually means, why a time-stamped email can one day be the difference between walking away with nothing and walking away with what you earned. She does for them, early, what no one did for her until almost too late. Her staff is small. For people, Zoe is 9 now. She is, by every account, thriving. She is sharp and funny and deeply, visibly secure in the way that children are secure when the adult they are closest to has stopped being afraid. She knows, in the way that 9-year-olds know things, not in full detail, not in legal terminology, that her mother fought for something important. She knows that her mother won. She tells people, when they ask what her mom does, she helps women who got taken advantage of. And then she adds, without any prompting, with complete matter-of-fact certainty, my mom is my hero. Adunala was asked in an interview, several months after the practice opened, what she would say to her younger self. The woman she was before graduate school, before the networking event, before the napkin sketch and the pitch decks and the investor dinners and the years of quiet, unacknowledged, invaluable work. She thought about it for a moment. Not long. Like she had already known the answer for some time and was simply deciding how to say it. And then she said, write everything down. Every email. Every sacrifice. Every late night where you stayed up restructuring someone else's vision because you believed in it more than they believed in themselves. Write it down. Keep it. Because your work is real, even when no one around you is willing to say so. And one day, if it ever comes to that, a judge will say it for them. There is a framed photograph on her desk. It is not a company award, not a legal certificate, not a press clipping. It is a photograph of Zoe, taken on a Saturday morning at the kitchen table of the home that is now entirely, unambiguously, completely theirs. Zoe is laughing at something off camera. It is a laugh that belongs to a child who feels completely safe. Adunala keeps it on the left side of her keyboard, where she sees it every time she sits down to work. She built a man's company with her bare hands and her grandmother's money and 11 years of her life. She sat in a parking lot and came apart completely. And then she answered the phone. She walked into a courtroom as a wife they had tried to dismiss. And she walked out as a stakeholder, an attorney, and the most dangerous thing a person can become after being underestimated, someone who knows exactly what they are worth. Here is what Juno Kwan believed when he walked out of that kitchen. He believed she would accept the settlement, that she would be practical and disappear. He forgot one thing, just one. She was always the one who understood the numbers. From the very beginning, from that networking event where she looked at his napkin sketch and immediately identified the legal structure that would get him sued, she was the one who understood how things actually worked. Not just emotionally, not just relationally, structurally, financially, legally. He built a company. She understood it. And in the end, the numbers told the truth. They always do. 47 investor emails. 1 wire transfer. $47,000. 11 years. 34%. 1 daughter thriving. 1 bar exam passed. 1 practice open. 1 name, her name, only hers on the door. The numbers told the truth. Who thought, at some point in the last few minutes, that sounds familiar? Who has been the invisible architecture of something that carries someone else's name? Who has been doing the work without the title, making the calls without the credit, holding something together with both hands while someone else takes the photograph? Document it. Start today. Not because you are planning for the worst, but because your work is real. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Because somewhere right now, there is a woman who needs to hear it. And she needs to know that is not the end of the story. It is not even close to the end. And if you want to see more stories like this, where women refuse to be written out of their own lives, where the truth has a way of surfacing regardless of how carefully someone tried to bury it, where justice takes its time but does not forget, you already know what to do. Come back next week. Because next week, a woman opens a letter addressed to her husband. Inside it, a name she doesn't recognize, a child's name, and then another letter, and another. It takes her 11 days to piece together the full picture. Her husband had a second family, for 9 years. And what she did with that information, the very specific, very deliberate, very irreversible thing she chose to do, will leave you completely speechless. Don't go anywhere.